Record. Sorry, Siri. Hellenistic, which we talked about last time, is the kind of fancy academic word for Greek influence on things. So Greco-Roman, sometimes a phrase you hear me say a lot. And boy, this owl is right up my nose. The Hellenistic culture was a huge influence, and Rome had a tendency to, this may sound a little familiar, to invade and sack their enemies and then subsume their culture. So all of the Greek design and structure and everything kind of got adopted by Rome. So that's where we get kind of Greco-Roman things. It's why kind of Rome and Greece kind of have general kind of similarities and stuff. Now, I'm not an expert in this all. I just took Latin in college, in high school. So I'm just drawing on that a little bit. So the Hellenistic influence meant that that was not the working class language. People didn't walk around in Jesus's area and time in Palestine and just talk Greek to each other. They spoke Aramaic, which was a derivation of Hebrew. And but the written word was Greek. So what they used, what was kind of around in the temples were Hebrew scriptures on a scroll. But they were also, now in that period of time, they had something called the Septuagint, which was, the Septuagint is Septugi, there's probably an A in there, NT. And that is the first translation of the Hebrew scriptures in Greek. So that was a big deal. That was kind of like their book of the moment, their Da Vinci Code, or you know, whatever, or their To Kill a Mockingbird. And that was what all the educated people had at their disposal, even in Palestine, was the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures. So Greek, that was the name of the game. But Greek is a sophisticated language. You had to be really educated in order to write and speak Greek. So Paul, of course, could do that. And so his letters are written in a native Greek as well, a biblical Greek, we call it today. Just so you know, that's kind of the background on all of that. If you're still curious and want to do more academic dive, you could do no worse than the Anchor Yale Bible, which is, and it's got a volume and sometimes two volumes for each book of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. And this is a huge book that they still use in teaching in seminaries. Tons and tons of notes. It's basically like your study Bible, but without the Bible part. It's just notes and notes and notes. And sometimes they get definitely into the woods about the writings, the translations and things as well. And I didn't bring it, I meant to bring it, I just didn't have enough arm space. But those of us who've been doing Bible study, particularly recently, we've been turned on to a book that's more user-friendly that I highly recommend, called Holy Imagination by Judy Fentress Williams. And Judy was my professor of Old Testament and Hebrew in seminary, and I learned everything from her. And
what was the title of the book again, please?
Holy Imagination. And that just came out during the pandemic and is her overview of the whole Bible. She takes each one a chapter at a time and just gives you the bare bones of what you need to know in each book, so you know what you're reading before you open it. I can't recommend it enough, and I refer to it a lot here too.
Is she that black woman that
Yes.
you had?
Exactly right. Barb's got a picture of it right there. There you go.
Oh, but it's backwards.
Oh no, we see it correctly. Yep.
Oh, you do? Okay.
For we see through a scanner darkly, right? through a glass darkly, right? Isn't it great? And we had Judy on in the summer, and video is still on the YouTube page if anybody wants to watch it. And she was our guest. I was reminded watching Ketanji Brown Jackson's interviews yesterday. I was like, wow, she and Judy look just alike. Same hairstyle and everything. And I was like, and Judy would be just as poised as Judge Jackson was, going through all the baloney she said yesterday. Let me just say a word. I think her answers on her faith were so accurate because of she's aware of what she does for a living. She's a faith does not come into play. Now, we know her faith comes into play. It's a person she is, and that's what it is. But they're playing these kind of gotcha questions and back at her Democrats for Amy Coney Barrett stuff and all. But he basically was kind of curt and just said, I'm a non-denominational Christian. And other than that, I don't see how my faith has any bearing on, my public service. And I just thought I wanted to stand up and clap. So she did great. Okay, but back to Romans. I'm going to share my screen, everybody. 1 second. So we see you at home, but we're going to not see you for a couple minutes. But I think you'll still see us. All right. It's like shifting gears. Okay. So you should be able to see the screen, but now I'm going to play the. Dun, 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 dun. All right. I need an audible from people at home. Can you see that okay?
Yes.
Thank you.
Fine.
All right, there's our buddy Paul. Let me just do a quick recap here. The book of Romans is a letter, and it was written in the winter of 57 to 58 CE, Common Era. You would have grown up calling it AD. We still call it that sometimes. And it's written from Corinth in Greece. It is the last writing of Paul's in the New Testament. And as we kind of spent some time saying last week, it doesn't mean it's the last thing Paul ever wrote. Unfortunately, it's the last thing known to historians that Paul ever wrote. So we think he lived another 10 years. I find it hard to believe he wasn't writing during that time. But this is the last one scholars think came chronologically from Paul. But it's first in the New Testament among the letters because it's the longest one. In this letter, again, things you're going to be looking for throughout that we didn't really get to last week are Paul's reference to the gospel, the good news, which we did talk about, and his overall theme of illustrating Christ's death and resurrection having the power to save. This is the origins of this major theology about how Christ's death and resurrection is a healing and saving thing for all people. And then Paul will talk a lot about righteousness redefining grace. So he will work out the oft revisited argument of justification by faith versus justification by works, which ultimately Paul's argument for grace, which is the idea that we don't do anything to gain God's favor. God gives it to us because God is full of love, and that's who God is, and we are just called to receive it. We don't have to do any extra things to earn God's grace. There's some head nods in the room, which I think I would go to say that means we agree that feels right to us. But we know we were both raised, and we know there are other traditions that highly emphasize doing good works, and we can't help but think sometimes we have to do things in order to get into heaven. David, I see your hands raised. Feel free to unmute and chime in here when you get a sec.
I just have a question about the timing of the book of Romans. There was a set of letters called the prison epistles that he wrote while he was in fact at Rome. So I was just wondering how this fit in chronologically with those epistles.
That's a good point. Prison. So you mean extra canonical letters?
No. I mean like Ephesians and Colossians and Philemon. They're called part of the prison epistles. They're largely considered to be written while he was a prisoner in Rome. So I was just bringing that up as a question.
That's a good question, and I think again that we think those were written before Romans, but as to where they were written from, either them being written from Rome is in dispute, because again, I think we talked about last week that they believe Paul had not visited Rome at the time of the writing of this letter. So maybe it's the origin of where the location of those prison epistles were written from. I'm trying to think. Thought I used to know Ephesians off the top of my head, but it's just
Well,
drawn.
I'm not absolutely sure about these, but I know Philemon was considered one of them. So I don't know.
Exactly. All right.
This,
Well,
this is not important. It's just speculation anyway, because
that's good.
there's no question. So
I haven't heard that before, that those epistles are grouped together called the prison epistles, but I know he was in prison in a lot of different places. I know he was in prison in Philippi, for example. But it's never that I hope this is right. He never writes a letter from prison to the people that are imprisoning him. Although that may have worked. He always is writing a letter to them from another location. And it's usually in the case of checking in on their Christianity and how it's going, or responding to questions they had or reports he got from his colleagues like Timothy or Silas. And Romans is the only one where he hadn't visited yet. So he was anticipating going to Rome for mission. But that's a good one. I wrote that down. Let's see if I can actually remember to do my homework this week. Okay. There are problematic issues in Romans that have caused mostly Christians to go off, and probably more on the non-denominational evangelical side, to go off or those that read the Bible literally. These will often cause problems that will, things will be used out of context or sometimes in context and unfairly. Issues of original sin, that's the doctrine that believes that come from Augustine of Hippo, later working off Paul's work that says that we were made perfect in Eden, the Garden of Eden, and that the original sin was the disobeying of God and taking the apple. And then very easy by medieval times to just blame it on the woman. And I've given many sermons where I rescue Eve from that and remind then it's a team effort and everyone is blaming everyone. And then faith versus works, we just talked about spirit versus flesh, and that will be interesting when we get to that, to just see Paul parse out if we are just kind of these hollow bodies containing a spirit, then why do we have all of these issues of the flesh, such as lust and things. And then, of course, human sexuality and LGBT concerns. There are some things here that are often used, a couple quotes in Romans that are used to give evidence to say the Bible says XYZ negatively about homosexuality. Okay. And just remember, your overall impression of Romans is that it's an early Christian defense. It's an illustration for Paul of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. If you're looking at me on screen, I'm just reading over to my laptop. That's just in case you're wondering. It looks like I'm about to throw up or something, but I feel great. All right. And then we did the structure, and I did come prepared with some charts. So just a reminder on the structure, we showed this last week of just, you can break up these letters into parts. It's more than a simple letter of, hey, how are you? What's the weather like in Rome? Things are great here in Corinth. Instead, it is an address and greeting, and then he lays out doctrine, and then he sermonizes in a way that is basically preaching things they should be doing or should not be doing. And then it kind of basically concludes. All right. This came up for sure last time. Here's a little bit of a timeline, very, very rudimentary timeline, roughly. So in 33 AD or CE, Jesus is crucified according to tradition. It may have been give or take 3 years around that. And then around that same year was the first apostle outside of the disciples. Remember the one who took the missing 12th spot from Judas when they cast lots for that. Stephen in Acts 8 gives his great speech to the Pharisees and is then stoned. And remember what Stephen said when he was being stoned, Father, forgive them, they know not what they're doing, or a variation on that. Paul stands at the foot of the robes that are thrown so that the people can, move their arms better to throw stones at Stephen. So Paul's a witness to that. The next year is what we think is when the conversion of Paul happened on the road to Damascus. However that happened, supernatural or all in his head, it still happened. In 37 and for the next few decades or so, Paul is making little trips from Jerusalem as kind of his home base to little places in southern Turkey and that kind of area, places where he would have grown up. And then begins one of 3 missionary journeys, and I'm going to show these on a map in a second. First journey is from 48 to 49, so about 2 years he's gone on a journey, and in his journey to do what he feels called to do, which is spread the good news by forming churches. The second missionary journey is in 51 to 53, so a longer journey. And then the third missionary journey is even longer, and that's 54 to 57. In between all of those, if you're wondering what happens in between, he returns to Jerusalem, okay? And then when he returns to Jerusalem in 57, at the end of his last journey, he's arrested. On the arrest, he is on his way to Rome. So again, this causes into question what David was talking about, was where is Paul? If Paul's in Corinth, is he in captivity? Is he not in captivity? Some of those details are a little foggy when he writes this letter, because it was written maybe around 59. And then he's in house arrest in Rome. So we often say he's in chains or in prison. He says he's in chains, but it's a little bit more like Michael Cohen, Trump's lawyer, kind of. He's at home and he's just still able to talk. Just trying to keep it relevant, right?
Yeah.
Here's a map of his first missionary journey, okay? So there you're looking at the Mediterranean. And the adventures begin then from Antioch, which is in modern day Syria. And you set sail from the coast, goes through Cyprus, goes up to Pamphylia, and then kind of up in this. It's basically all in modern day Turkey, that whole region up there. You can see it's delineated in this map as partly Asia, Galatia, which is where we get the letter to the Galatians, Cappadocia, Cilicia, that kind of thing. So not a huge distance from where he was, but he's learning. The second journey, he leaves from, and this is all in Italian actually, he leaves from Jerusalem at the bottom right of your screen, and goes north back to Antioch, a common trip for him, and then Tarsus, or Tarso, in Cilicia, and then goes to Derbe, Lystra, Iconio, Antiochia, different than the other Antiochia, and crosses Asia. There's Ephesus, kind of in the middle of the screen, by the way. He goes to Troad. Anybody know what that is in English? Troy. As in the, still there. Then crosses over into, let me see, does my cursor work on here? Can you see my cursor at home? This is where Istanbul is today.
Oh, okay.
That's where the separation really of Asia to Europe is, we might say. And then this is kind of the area that stretches over from Turkey into Greece. So there he is in these little areas. Philippi is like the letter to the Philippians. Some of these are letters. Thessaloniki is in northern Greece. Athens, Corinth, and Cenchreae. I don't know where that is. Yeah.
Kind of walking.
A lot of walking, a lot of boat riding.
Greg,
Maybe some camels. Yeah.
on these missionary trips, was he visiting established churches or was he recruiting new?
I think it's a mixture of both.
Okay.
To the best of our knowledge, he is, so on the first missionary journey, it's really he's setting foot for the first time in some places. On the second journey, he's revisiting some of those places and then also going to new places. And now on this third missionary journey, he is revisiting places, and most of these are all revisits. So there you go.
Is there a historical record of how these little churches were established in these various places
I'm-
before he even got there?
Yeah, no, I'm sure there are. Some of it, I don't have a command of the history of it all, but I
Mhm.
think some of it is he dispatched people to do it for him.
Okay.
It wasn't always physically him having to do the church planting, but some of the major areas, like you can see on this map, the titles with bigger letters, which sounds like Paul. See what big letters I write.
Mhm.
Probably the bigger towns, the more prestigious ones he would been involved in.
Okay.
Or, for example, when he writes to the Galatians, you see that that's just an area. That's
Mhm.
not even a town. So he's writing to all the churches in Galatia, and there's probably no way he could have set up individually one of them. But sometimes it's like it's infectious. So he sets up one and he leaves people behind to run it, or deputizes people. And that's how we get into some situations in Acts where he's got Apollos, who was kind of a follower, but then kind of starts to become like the cult of Apollos. And Paul has to correct that and say Apollos is not Jesus Christ. Remember, he's not even Paul of Tarsus. So can we just like stop with the love for Apollos and remember that it's about God and Christ? So it's a little bit like that. It's just kind of
I think there's,
Go ahead, David.
I was just gonna say, I don't think there's any secular historical record that would provide any verification or any further clarification. The best we can tell is what we have in the New Testament, because it really wasn't considered that important to secular historians. They didn't really keep track of the specific spread of Christianity.
Yeah, it's a little bit like counting ants. It's just kind of it's a little bit like, woo, all of a sudden Christianity is just kind of popping up. And yeah, everything I'm saying is speculatory for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so in the third journey, the map you see on screen, it begins in Antioch, Tarsus, Derbe. So now he's revisiting places he's been before. Galatia area, Ephesus, again, Troy, and Philippi, Thessaloniki, a new town of Berea, and then down to Athens, Corinth. And then basically it's kind of hard to see with the green, slightly darker green. He goes back the way he came, basically, and except around the Ephesus area, and then he kind of goes a different way south, back through Tyre and Caesarea. Yeah. Okay, there's a primer for you. I'm going to stop my share so we can see your faces again. Hello. All right.
Is that place called Patara? Is that Petra?
Let's see, Patara. No, I don't think it's Petra.
Petra's in Turkey, isn't it?
It looks like what is it called today? It starts with an A. Well, I'm sure somebody could Google it for sure. All right.
Well, and then it's not Petra, because Petra's still called Petra.
So let's return to chapter 1, where we did a greeting. We read a greeting from Paul, and then there was Paul talking about his plans to visit, and in verse 8, a reiteration of what he feels is the good news about the faithfulness being spread throughout the whole world, and why he serves, what he believes, and then he gets into another kind of thesis statement in 15 to 17, which I'm just going to reread briefly here. That's why I'm ready to preach the gospel. This is from the CEB Bible, Common English Bible. That's why I'm ready to preach the gospel also to you who are in Rome. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It is God's own power for salvation to all who have faith in God, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. God's righteousness is being revealed in the gospel from faithfulness for faith, as it is written, the righteous person will live by faith. All right, and now we move to verse 18 to the end of the chapter. I've done enough talking. Would someone like to read from their book? Anyone? And maybe someone at home or at the office, I should say.
I can
Brendan's
do
like,
that.
I'm not at home. Leslie, yes, please. Thank you. So 18 to the end of the chapter.
Okay. I just want to say one thing before I start reading, because this next section is going to be kind of a hard section to listen to and to try to figure out. But what I will say is when you read the letters, all of the epistles, you need to read them in their entirety, like in one sitting, or like Romans is a little longer, so you can do it in 2 sittings, but you need to get the context of the whole, what he's saying all together. Because when you pick out verses and you say, okay, I'm going to read the first 5 verses and let's figure out what he's saying here, you're not getting the full context of what he wants to say and what he's telling us. And when you go into chapter 2 from chapter 1, it explains why he's saying what he's saying. But I will read. I just wanted to get people an idea, because it's really a good idea to sit down and read these in entirety before you start going back and picking through.
That's
It gives you a
wonderful.
better,
You're
it gives
absolutely
you a
right.
better, gives you a better idea of what he's trying to encourage. You can't do it, not every book, like the Gospels doesn't work quite that way, but the letters really are, because these are, we have to remember, these are letters written to somebody else.
Excellent.
Okay. Gentiles are without excuse. That's I'm reading out of the CEB too also. God's wrath is being revealed from heaven against all the ungodly behavior and the injustice of human beings who silence the truth with injustice. This is because what is known about God should be plain to them, because God made it plain to them. Ever since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, God's eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, because they are understood through the things God has made. So humans are without excuse. Although they knew God, they didn't honor God as God or thank him. Instead, their reasoning became pointless and their foolish hearts were darkened. While they were claiming to be wise, they made fools of themselves. They exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images that look like mortal humans, birds, animals, and reptiles. So God abandoned them to their hearts' desires, which led to the moral corruption of degrading their own bodies with each other. They traded God's truth for a lie, and they worshiped and served the creation instead of the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. That's why God abandoned them to degrading lust. Their females traded natural sexual relations for unnatural sexual relations. Also, in the same way, the males traded natural sexual relations with females, and burned with lust for each other. Males performed shameful actions with males, and they were paid back with the penalty they deserved for their mistake in their own bodies. Since they didn't think it was worthwhile to acknowledge God, God abandoned them to a defective mind to do inappropriate things. So they were filled with injustice, wicked behavior, greed, and evil behavior. They are full of jealousy, murder, fighting, deception, and malice. They are gossips. They slander people, and they hate God. They are rude and proud, and they brag. They invent ways to be evil, and they are disobedient to their parents. They are without understanding, disloyal, without affection, and without mercy. Though they know God's decision that those who persist in such practices deserve death, they not only keep doing those things, but also approve others who practice them.
Excellent. So glad for your disclaimer, Leslie. I knew this was coming. I didn't know it was coming so soon.
Yeah,
So thank you.
if you're reading, I've been reading the Daily Office out of the back of the
Book?
prayer book, and right now, for some reason during Lent, we're reading Romans, and so I've been reading Romans doing my daily office readings each morning. And last week, one day, I read that, and and it was interesting because it only picks out certain verses, and then the next day you get to the next part, and it makes it much more agreeable on why and and how we need to react to these this is a whole long list of things that God hates.
Yeah, what
There
do you,
is
go
an,
ahead, Brendan.
sorry, there's an, just, I was reading the message version of this, and it's a very different inflection you get in verses 26 and 27. Do you mind if I read it real fast? It's just a couple of lines.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It says, worse followed, refusing to know God. They soon didn't know how to be human either. Women didn't know how to be women. Men didn't know how to be men. Sexually confused, they abused and defiled one another. Women with women, men with men, all lust, no love. And they paid for it. Oh, how they paid for it. Emptied of God and love, godless and loveless wretches. So it seems to me that they're talking not so much about sexual orientation, which wasn't even really a thing at the time, as they are lustful versus love-filled sexual expression, which I think is really important and really key to understanding this and many of the misinterpretations we've seen of it.
You are 100% correct. I couldn't said it better myself. It's the first thing to understand is, and thank you, Brendan, for reading that, because that translation is so modern. He took pains to get behind the meanings of the original words, instead of a kind of even a more like modern, antiquated translation that the English doesn't give us very well. Paul and his contemporaries had no concept of a loving relationship between two people of the same gender. They had no concept of people struggling with gender identity. They had no concept that someone could be transitioned from female to male or male to female. The list goes on and on. You know, the only example they had really was when Romans would take Roman men of high stature would take young male slaves as kind of sexual slaves, basically, like kind of like an older male, younger thing. And they knew that was wrong. So you start to then apply it to anyone that has any sexual relations with, you know, and again, they're looking at just the sexual act, right, as unnatural, immoral. Well, even the concept of being unnatural to someone who is gay, for example, it is unnatural for them to have sex with a person of the opposite gender. So unnatural is in the eye of the beholder, really. This is an example of Paul's limitations. I'm not saying he's not homophobic. I'm just saying he didn't have an education or a you know, a wherewithal to even know what that means, right? Does that make sense, everybody? That's just the ground level part of it all, right?
I just think that maybe this society was very prudish, because I was listening to a thing on NPR yesterday that was talking about the don't say gay law down in Florida.
Mhm.
And they were talking about other societies, and there have been throughout history, Native Americans, Asians have, they were talking about they had 5 levels of sexual orientation, not just man and woman, but
Right.
5 different levels that they recognized of sexual orientation.
Mhm.
It had nothing to do with your biologically assigned genitalia.
Right, exactly.
So, I mean, if they can, those were primitive, you know, what we consider primitive tribes, ancient tribes that had a different understanding. So maybe these people are just more prudish. I don't know.
Sure. David, you have something to say.
It's a completely different historical context, has already been alluded to. In this context, first of all, it was very, very patriarchal. It was considered very more male dominated. In fact, Rome kind of functioned around the whole concept of the pater familias, the guy who's in charge of the family, the male being in charge. And it was considered very shameful for a male in that culture to be the submissive one in the sex act. So this is part of what's going on behind it. It also applied to the Jews. They had the same attitude going back for a long time. There are also practices in the Gentile community, such as prostitution, temple prostitution. That might be part of what behind what Paul's saying, especially in terms of women and things that, talking
Right.
about things that women did. But the important thing, because it's hard for us to really understand the entire historical context, but to realize that the whole historical context out of which Paul is writing is completely different than ours. And like Greg said, they had no understanding of human sexuality in terms of same-sex attraction that we do now. So Paul is a man of his time. He's doing the best he can. He's trying to set up a case where he's trying to set up the Gentiles and why they are far away from God. And then he's going to compare them to the Jews in chapter 2 and say that they're really no better. This is all behind what he's trying to do, is trying to say, that you look at the Gentiles and you see them this way and you explain them this way. And this is the way you look at them. It's terribly sinful. And then in chapter 2, he's going to turn it around and say, are you really any better in your practices? Do you fulfill the law? So yeah, this is a complex passage that's too often simplified using terms that maybe aren't so accurate anymore.
Would he do it if he had a chance to do it today, knowing what he knows today? He would go, I used the wrong examples. I honestly believe that. Because he goes on to list in 28 all these other things that are universal. They're not just about same-sex attraction.
Mhm.
And again, if you're a cherry picker that picks out verses, how do you get to decide to pick out that one and not all these other things that we are all guilty of, including jealousy, deception, gossip, rudeness, proudness, braggness, inventing ways to be evil, disobedient to our parents? I mean, that's all of us times 1,000, right?
Right.
Well, maybe times 100.
I just think one other thing is to say is to be in Paul's defense. There are certain contemporary biblical interpreters that say that maybe this isn't entirely Paul's belief, but he's using a rhetorical device where he's presenting the view that the Jews have of the Gentiles. And then he's kind of turning it around and saying, you're really no better. So maybe we're, not being as fair to Paul. Maybe we don't understand the rhetorical device he was using here in this particular instance.
Great point. It gets back to what I was saying about the Greek, which is, we're in the hands of an extremely gifted writer and orator who is using all of these devices, which are still used to this day by people like Martin Luther King. Well, not this day, but great speakers and all the devices that he uses and the fun he has with language. I wanted to say, when you reference David, the Jews, that remember back to Genesis, Exodus, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, that that scripture, which would have been in the minds of all of the people in the first century, that scripture lays out a case for marriage that is procreation based and is still the doctrine of the Roman Catholic Church, that the point of marriage is to make children, right? And Catholics have been really good at making children for generations now, right? The impossibility that goal from, this is my argument here, this personal argument, the possibility that argument from God to Abraham to spread your seed, quite literally, amongst the world, is maybe a bygone thing for a bygone time when we needed to procreate and build the Jewish people. We are overpopulated now, and again, I think if God were here today, doing all this now in this day, he'd be like, "Don't need that many children. Maybe cap it at 2, 3, maybe. Whatever happens. But you don't need to have 12. That's not quite what I meant. And more importantly, you do not have to be in a marriage because of the act of procreating. Maybe marriage is about love and partnership and intimacy with another human being, and that again was not anything they had a concept of with people of the same gender. So Any questions, anybody? Any thoughts? I've talked too much. What other feelings do you have? Yeah, it's Greg.
One little observation at the very last verse, verse 32, where it says, they know God's just decree that all who do such things deserve death. So being greedy or gossiping or,
Disrespecting your parents?
yeah, being a little envious deserve death. That seems like a very harsh
It
God
does.
that Paul is proclaiming there.
Right. It does, absolutely, yeah. And again, it's hard to see if that's just
It's-
rhetoric. He's reflecting what they teach and preach,
Mhm.
or if that's what he
It's a
truly
God of, it's a God of law. It's a God of the law that the Hebrews worshipped. It's a God that they had to sacrifice in order to propitiate with blood sacrifices to forgive their sins. That was how the Jews viewed God. That's how they viewed him. That was their interaction with God. Part of the covenant was that they would obey the commands. It was very much law centered.
And remember the law, the 10 Commandments, the beginning of their law, their Bill of Rights. The first one is do not worship false idols. And that if there's anything that God is more concerned about, according to the Hebrews, maybe make sure I insert that clause, is worshiping other false idols. And that is also mentioned here, idolatry. And by the way, I would tell to any child dealing with their sexuality or adult still coping with it, I would say, it's probably helpful to remember that none of the 10 Commandments talk about sexuality.
Mhm.
So there you go.
Except envying your neighbor's wife.
Well, covet neighbor's possessions,
Yeah.
probably fairer translation. Yeah, exactly. But I mean, more talking about homosexuality. Yeah.
Correct,
Yeah.
I understand that.
Mhm. Good stuff. Anyone else on Zoom have any thoughts or reflections on it all? Okay, we solved it.
We never will solve it.
We fixed it. Now everyone will understand, right? No more problems. All right, let's continue in chapter 2 for a few more minutes. I'm sorry we started late. Would anyone like to read chapter 2? Let's go a little slow to maybe verse 1 to 11.
I can read it on the women's devotional.
Okay, Carol's got it.
It says, God's righteous judgment. You therefore have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else. For at whatever point you judge the other, you are condemning yourself, because you who pass judgment do the same things. Now we know that God's judgment against those who do such things is based on truth. So when you, a mere man, pass judgment on them and yet do the same things, do you think you will escape God's judgment? Or do you show contempt for the riches of his kindness, tolerance, and patience, not realizing that God's kindness leads you towards repentance? But because of your stubbornness and your unrepentant heart, you are storing up wrath against yourself for the day of God's wrath, when his righteous judgment will be revealed. God will give to each person according to what he has done. Sounds like the 7 levels of Dante.
Not
To
wrong.
those who by persistence in doing good seek glory, honor, and immortality, he will give eternal life. But for those who are self-seeking and who reject the truth and follow evil, there will be wrath and anger. There will be trouble and distress for every human being who does evil, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. But glory, honor, and peace for everyone who does good, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. For God does not show favoritism.
Well, that doesn't work if you're a church leader, does it? Oops, historically.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So, why does it say the Jew first and then the Gentile? Why is that like distinction made.
Mine says Greek.
Yeah.
Mine
Yeah,
says
some
Jew.
of our
None-
translations say
none
Greek. Gentile's not wrong. It's just saying Jew and not Jew, which for them mostly
Oh,
meant. But you're right. You're saying, why does it say Jew first? Greek.
Is it because?
and
it's
is it
this-
because they're
Should
supposed
know.
to be the chosen people?
That's kind of the origin of it. Absolutely. Yeah. David's
Okay.
not like, David, help.
No, you're absolutely right, Barb. It was God's covenant first started to the Jews, but also at the very beginning, he made it clear that this covenant was through the Jews to the rest of the world, that they were supposed to be the means of sharing his love, his grace through the rest of the world. So that's exactly what that means, Barb. You're right.
Thank you.
It's not quite like it's like they've lined them up and, Jews first, Gentiles wait longer.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm just consulting my notes. What other things do you all notice or have questions about? Also an intense passage. But
Well,
again,
this points out exactly what David and Leslie were saying, that first he gave all these things that were terrible that people were doing, but then he's saying, don't shake your finger at people for doing that because you're no better,
Exactly.
and that God will remember that at the judgment time.
Which kind of plays into what he's saying in the latter part of that letter 1. He's just he's laying out a case that we all are guilty of a great, nobody's better than anybody else. We all have things to atone for. We all,
Casting the first stone.
right. It's a big deal for him.
I was just thinking that,
It's a big deal.
especially if you live in a glass house.
Right.
Right,
exactly,
right.
Exactly.
Or if you point at somebody and say, you got three other fingers pointing back at you.
I like
Yeah.
that.
The problem is, the English translation, is accurate, I would assume, but these words out of context, I can just, my neck, just like the hairs raise up when I hear wrath of God, because it's just something admittedly we shy away from, but it's there nonetheless in the bedrock of theology, that there is, that God gets angry, that God is not happy. It's not necessarily there that God punishes in a way like, causes natural disasters and stuff, but you can see how this can get twisted out of context, right? And more to what Leslie was saying, please read the whole letter, which we're trying to do. We just can't physically do it all at once. But any of these phrases without the whole letter are meaningless, really. What's that, Leslie? I'm sorry.
I was just saying, you don't have to do it. We can't read it all at one time here, of course, but
But we're trying.
we can do it at home ahead of time so that we can get it just. The only other thing I just like is when I think about the wrath of God, and it's something that's been really bothering me. It's a question: does God really have a wrath, or is he just all loving? And I don't know if he's an all loving God. If an all loving God can be angry. That doesn't mean he doesn't. He can discipline. We can be disciplined. We have to. When we sin or we do something wrong, we have to deal with the consequences.
Right.
That's, and that's not God's wrath. That's just we did something wrong, and we're going to have to live up to it and, apologize or do whatever we need to do to not be there where, but, I don't think of it as God's wrath. I don't know what it is. I know he can get angry because Jesus got angry. He came in and threw up the temple all over the place.
Right.
What
But,
if we just? Sorry,
ahead.
Leslie, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm saying, but I don't know when it comes to his wrath, how, if he's actually just, his wrath is making you so you have an illness or whatever. And I don't think he does that, because I don't think he can. I don't think God being a loving person, and that he can go against his own characteristics, his own, his own love. So, because he still loves us, and that doesn't mean he doesn't. It's just that he gets angry. He gets upset because we're not doing what
We know better.
We know, yeah, right. We know better. Thanks.
Right.
Go ahead, Barb.
You said what I was going to in terms of, I just look at it, God is a loving God. And like a parent, when they get angry or we do something that we need to be corrected, they want us to be better. And I think when you think the wrath, I always thought that was such a strong, like almost too strong of a word, but that, he needs to call us on our behavior when it's not what he knows we could be better at. And so that's how I look at it. It's no different than a parent when you have to correct, a child or a grandchild. It's out of love because you know that they can do better and you want them to do better.
I think you're absolutely right.
Well, I
Absolutely
think a
right.
lot of words in the Bible do that kind of stuff. I think wrath doesn't, to me, when you say wrath, it doesn't say that God's disappointed in us. And I think that when my kids would do something wrong and I'd get angry, it was more of a disappointment than to me, wrath is just like, you see the devil getting, and
Right.
they're all angry and
Wrath
Yes.
is what and feels.
Right,
Is not
exactly.
necessarily what is coming from God.
Right. So,
And your parent metaphor is just spot on because, I feel like I've watched friends with young children, and I think everyone here except me has children. So you all can relate more than I can, but I've just witnessed it, which is I've seen, and I've been a child. I've seen a friend punish a child, and they're so angry and disappointed, and the child is being so, pushed back and being fresh, as we say, or talking about. And then the parent punishes them, and then the kid is crying. And then after the kid goes to their room crying, the parent starts crying. And I remember asking my friend, I was like, why are you crying? She's like, I don't know, I'm just upset. And I was like, that's God, right? God is like, it pains me to have to be mad, to have this relationship with you, but it pains me not to be able to intervene, for example,
well, that's what I was meaning, that wrath, it doesn't sound like it doesn't include love in there.
Right, exactly, right. The
Well,
loving of
I
relationship.
think maybe if we look at it, that God's wrath is against, not necessarily against people, but his disposition, his disappointment. It's directed towards the behavior. He hates bad behavior because it has bad results. And I think part of it is that God isn't just standing up there with lightning bolts firing them at us, but he realizes that when we do engage in certain behaviors, there are natural consequences.
Right.
And it's not like he has to punish us, but we're going to bring punishment on ourselves. And
Right.
and God doesn't just stand there dispassionately saying, oh, well, he'll learn, but it hurts God because it hurts us. And
Exactly.
that's, I think, kind of, yeah.
Beautiful way to say it. And a perfect note to end on, I think. Thank you, everyone. Sorry we got started late. We'll try to figure it out in advance next time. I will try to figure it out in advance next time. And we'll see you next time.
Everybody.
We'll get better, I
Have
promise.
a good week.
Oh, Brandon, before
Yeah.
you go, what book did you read that passage out of?
Oh, the message.
The message.
Yeah, is that the name of the book?
Yes.
It's the name of the translation. It's a translation of the Bible.
Yeah, if you Google the Message Bible, it'll come up for sure.
Ah, okay.
It's really good. It's a
That's
really
worth
good
it.
resource to have. It's very, very modern.
There's probably
Message
even
Bible.
a version online somewhere too, I bet. Yeah.
There is on Bible Gateway.
Oh, there you go, Bible
If you go to
Gateway.
BibleGateway.com, they have all kinds of different translations of the Bible.
And Dawn, mine is, the author of mine is Eugene Peterson, The Message.
Yeah.
Message remix. I love it.
Eugene.
I
I'm
have,
sorry, would you do that again? Eugene?
Peterson.
Yeah, I have the same one. But I don't always read it. I just have it sitting here.
Okay,
Okay.
I often look at it for sermon prep if I'm struggling with the text. You know, it's really helpful. He does it, it's basically the Bible in contemporary English. Yep.
Dawn, it's been just, my knowledge of the Bible is really limited. And so this has really helped supplement, the readings. It, as Greg said, it puts it in almost